domination of oppressed countries, the third world people generally call it, and strategic rivalry between the imperialist powers. And this is, again, I mentioned my book. I go into this quite a bit in my book. This isn't just about Americans being able to drive SUVs. Oil is a strategic commodity. And by that I mean control of oil gives one a disproportionate chokehold on the global economy. Any sharp rise in oil prices ripples through economies, helpful or hurtful. It has a giant impact on this. The other thing that's very important strategically about oil is that it gives one control of those who depend on oil. One of the people I quote in my book, people don't realize that one of the reasons the Soviet Union went bankrupt and collapsed in 1991 was that in the 80s, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia conspired to drive the price of, I document this, to drive the price of oil to $10 a barrel. One of the analysts in foreign affairs called the use of oil the economic equivalent of nuclear weapons. Right now, we see a new global rivalry, particularly with Europe, with China, with Russia, and much of it focuses over the control of oil. It is not an accident that the U.S. has over 200,000 to 300,000 troops in Iraq and Afghanistan today. And after all the talk that this war wasn't about oil, no, this had nothing to do with it, oh, of course not, that's a conspiracy theory, communist propaganda, whatever they want to say, read the New York Times earlier this year. Iraq, energy companies line up for Iraq oil bonanza. See, again, this is one of the ways they wanted to deal with this question of shrinking supplies that are easily accessible in the face of rising global demand in the world market, was going toward or reshape the Middle East. Again, these wars and the war on terror are not simply about oil. I don't want to leave that impression. There is also an effort to defeat Islamic fundamentalism. There's geopolitical maneuvering going on. There's a lot of layers to this. I'm not one that thinks one one particular element of anything explains everything. But that's certainly a big part of it. And the final point that I think is important to mention about the strategic nature of oil, it's crucial for military power. Winston Churchill said after World War I, we floated to victory on a sea of oil. They had just converted their Navy from coal to oil, which makes the ships faster and so on. And today, the U.S. military is the largest consumer of oil in the entire world. And if you take just the amount of petroleum spent on the invasion and occupation of Iraq on a daily basis, it puts the occupation of Iraq is ahead of 135 countries in terms of how much greenhouse gas is being emitted and how much oil is being used. I mean, that's a staggering amount. The other thing that I just want to touch on very briefly, I think I'm going to get through this in 45 minutes, Harry. I hope so. The other thing I just want to touch on briefly again, so the issue of war is never talked about in terms of the Gulf oil disaster. Those two things are never linked. And again, I'm against direct, simplistic linkage, but there is linkage. In other words, one reason the U.S. is drilling is it needs to control vast amounts of oil, whether it had adequate domestic supply or not, as a geopolitical weapon. So these two things are never brought together. This is an aside, but in September 2002, Bush gave a speech at the weeks later, a new national security strategy, basically calling for global hegemony, was published by the government. Yet the newspaper, the mainstream media, never the twain shall meet. No connection between these two.